The champagne flute felt heavier in my hand than it should have. Crystal, imported from France. A detail I'd researched and paid for, though my son would never know that. Around me, 300 wedding guests laughed and chattered, their voices blending into a symphony of celebration that felt increasingly distant from where I sat at table 12. Not table 1, where the mother of the groom traditionally belonged, but table 12, squeezed between distant cousins I'd met once at a funeral, and Charlie's college roommate who kept checking his phone. I adjusted the mint silk dress I'd chosen carefully. Elegant but not attention-grabbing, expensive but understated. At 62, I'd learned the art of occupying space without demanding it, of being present without being noticed. It was a skill that had served me well in ways my son would never understand. The wedding reception was everything Charlie and Christina had dreamed of. The Grandview Country Club, with its manicured lawns rolling toward the lake, white roses cascading from every surface, a 12-piece orchestra that had cost more than most people's cars. I knew because I'd seen the bills. I'd also seen who was paying them, though that particular detail had been carefully omitted from family conversations. "Ladies and gentlemen," the master of ceremonies announced, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. "The father of the bride would like to say a few words." Christina's father, Morris Thompson, rose from the head table with the confidence of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Real estate mogul, city council member, the kind of man whose handshake sealed deals worth millions. The kind of man who drove a Tesla and owned 3 houses, including the lakefront property where Christina had insisted on having her engagement photos taken. "My daughter Christina," Morris began, his voice warm with paternal pride, "has always been exceptional. Graduated summa cum laude from Yale, built her own marketing consultancy from the ground up, and now she's found her perfect match in Charlie." I watched my son's face light up as Morris continued, praising Christina's accomplishments, her independence, her drive. Each word was carefully chosen, each sentence a small monument to his daughter's worth. When Morris raised his glass in toast, the crystal caught the chandelier light and scattered it across the white tablecloth like tiny stars. The applause was thunderous. I clapped too, because that's what you do at weddings. You smile, you clap, you pretend that the careful choreography of celebration isn't sometimes an elaborate performance of things left unsaid. Then Charlie stood up. My son, my only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died when Charlie was 15. 28 years old now, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, his dark hair swept back exactly like his father's used to be. He cleared his throat, and the room fell silent in that expectant way crowds do when they sense something important is about to be said. "Thank you, Morris, for those beautiful words about Christina." Charlie's voice carried clearly across the room, confident and warm. "And I want to say something about the women who've shaped my life." My heart did that small flutter it always did when my son spoke publicly. Pride, anticipation, love, all the complex emotions that come with watching your child become the center of attention. "Christina's mother passed away when she was young," Charlie continued, "but her influence lives on in every amazing thing Christina has accomplished. And then there's Christina herself, my incredible wife." His voice caught slightly on the word wife, and several guests murmured appreciatively. "A woman who built her own company, who drives the car of the year, that beautiful BMW out in the parking lot, who owns her own condo in the city. Christina is what success looks like." The crowd murmured approval. I found myself nodding along, caught up despite myself in the moment. "And then," Charlie said, his tone shifting in a way that made my chest tighten, "there's my mother." All eyes turned to me. I felt my face arrange itself into what I hoped was an appropriately modest smile, the kind of expression mothers are supposed to wear when their children acknowledge them publicly. "My mother, Marcia," Charlie continued, and I could hear something in his voice now, something that made the champagne turn sour in my mouth. She's always been there. She never really did anything with her life, you know? Never had a career, never traveled, never built anything significant. She just existed, took care of things at home while the rest of us went out and achieved." The silence that followed felt different from the expectant quiet of moments before. This was the silence of a room full of people trying to process what they'd just heard. trying to understand if they'd misunderstood something. But that's okay, Charlie added quickly, perhaps sensing the shift in the room's energy. Not everyone needs to be ambitious. Some people are just there, and that's fine too. He raised his glass higher, and somehow, incredibly, people began to clap, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum, as if they'd decided this was indeed the appropriate response to whatever they thought they'd just witnessed. I clapped too. Of course I did. But inside my chest, something cold and sharp was taking shape. A clarity I hadn't felt in years was settling over me like winter air, clean and cutting and absolutely certain. While the applause continued, I reached into my purse, the modest black purse I'd carried for 3 years, purchased not because I couldn't afford better, but because invisibility had become my strategy, and found my phone. My fingers, steady despite the champagne and the shock, scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I was looking for. Mother, isn't Charlie's speech wonderful? Christina leaned over from the head table, her face glowing with newlywed happiness and what appeared to be genuine affection. For all her faults, my daughter-in-law had never been intentionally cruel to me. This moment wasn't about her. I smiled at Christina, the same smile I'd been perfecting for decades. Wonderful, I agreed, my voice carrying just the right note of maternal contentment. The reception continued around me. The first dance, the cake cutting, the bouquet toss that Christina aimed directly at her unmarried cousin. I participated in all of it, played my role perfectly. The invisible mother, the woman who had never done anything with her life, the placeholder person whose sole contribution to the world was having given birth to the man now spinning his accomplished wife across the dance floor. As the evening wound down and guests began filtering toward the coat check, I found myself alone for the first time in hours. Charlie and Christina were surrounded by well-wishers. Morris was holding court with other successful men near the bar, and I was exactly where I'd been all evening. Unnoticed, unimportant, unnecessary. I pulled out my phone again. The number I dialed belonged to Kevin Cook, senior partner at Cook, Mills & Associates, the law firm I'd been working with for the past 3 years, though my son knew nothing about that relationship. Kevin? I said quietly when he answered, stepping out onto the country club's terrace where the cool evening air carried the sound of my voice away from the lingering celebration. It's Marcia. I need you to activate Clause 12 of the contract we discussed. Marcia? Kevin sounded surprised to hear from me at this hour. Are you sure? Once we implement Clause 12, there's no going back. The trust will be restructured and Charlie will be completely removed as beneficiary. The legal documentation alone will take... I'm sure, I said, watching through the French doors as my son laughed at something one of his groomsmen had said. Draft the papers. I want everything transferred according to our previous discussions. This is about tonight, isn't it? Kevin asked gently. He'd been my lawyer long enough to read the tone in my voice. Marcia, maybe you should sleep on this. Family decisions made in anger. I'm not angry, Kevin. And surprisingly, I realized I wasn't. The cold clarity in my chest wasn't anger. It was something much more powerful. It was certainty. I'm finally thinking clearly. How long will the paperwork take? 2 weeks for the trust restructuring? Another week for the property transfers? Marcia, are you certain about the scope of this? We're talking about the house on Maple Street, the apartment building downtown, the 3 commercial properties, and all the agricultural land. That's substantial holdings to remove from Charlie's inheritance. I smiled into the darkness of the country club's garden. Kevin, my son just told 300 people that I never did anything with my life. I think it's time he learned exactly what I've been doing all these years. Through the French doors, I could see Charlie and Christina preparing to leave for their honeymoon. Jamaica, 2 weeks at a resort that cost more per night than most people earned in a month. They'd be back to their new life, their combined success, their bright future that apparently had no meaningful place for the woman who had made it all possible. Send me the documents when they're ready, I told Kevin. All of them. And Kevin, make sure the letter I dictated last month is included with Charlie's copy. The one explaining exactly what Clause 12 means and why it's being implemented. You're sure about this, Marcia? There's still time to... I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I ended the call and stood in the garden for a moment longer, breathing in the scent of late roses and listening to the distant sound of my son's laughter. Tomorrow, Charlie and Christina would fly to Jamaica. Next week, they'd return to their life together, secure in their success and their future. But in 2 weeks, when the lawyer's letters arrived, my son would discover that the woman who never did anything with her life had been building an empire while he wasn't paying attention. The flight back from Jamaica would land at 3:47 p.m. I knew this because I'd checked the airline's website 17 times in the past 2 days, not out of maternal concern for my son's safe return, but because I needed to time my next move perfectly. The legal documents would be delivered to Charlie and Christina's apartment at exactly 5:30 p.m., giving them just enough time to unpack their honeymoon glow before reality arrived in a manila envelope. I stood in my kitchen making coffee, the same kitchen Charlie had eaten breakfast in every morning for 13 years after his father died, the same kitchen where I'd helped him with calculus homework, where we'd planned his college applications, where I'd written check after check for his expenses while he focused on becoming the successful man he was today. The morning light streamed through windows I'd replaced 5 years ago, illuminating cabinets I'd refinished myself during one of Charlie's summers at camp. My son thought I'd never done anything with my life. As I stirred cream into my coffee, real cream from Riverside Dairy, not the artificial creamer I'd used for years to save money for his education, I almost laughed at the irony. Almost. The phone rang at 9:15. "Marcia? It's Heather." My former neighbor's voice carried that carefully controlled tone people use when they're about to deliver news they think might upset you. "I just wanted to check on you, dear. Zachary and I were at the wedding last night, and we heard Charlie's speech." Heather Price had lived next door for 8 years before moving to a retirement community in Arizona. She was one of the few people who remembered what my life had actually looked like during Charlie's teenage years. The early morning shifts I'd worked at the hospital, the weekend shifts at the catering company, the late-night bookkeeping I'd done for small businesses to supplement our income. "I'm fine, Heather. Thank you for calling. Marcia, honey, you know that boy doesn't know what he's talking about. I remember you working 3 jobs to keep that house, to pay for his car, his college. You sacrificed everything for him." I carried my coffee to the living room window, looking out at the neighborhood I'd fought to stay in when money was tight, when selling this house would have been the easy solution. The houses looked smaller than they had 20 years ago, but they were still solid, still respectable, still the kind of neighborhood where property values climbed steadily year after year. "Heather, did you ever wonder why I never remarried?" The question surprised us both. I hadn't planned to ask it. "Well, I assumed you were still grieving Morris. He was a good man, died so young, and you were so focused on Charlie." "I had offers," I said quietly. "Good men. Russell Farrell from the bank asked me out for 2 years before he finally stopped trying. Dr. Josh from the hospital. Even Kevin Cook before he became my lawyer." Heather was quiet on the other end of the line. "I chose not to remarry because I had a plan, Heather. Everything I did, every choice I made, was part of that plan." After Heather hung up, confused and concerned but too polite to press further, I walked through the house that Charlie thought was my only accomplishment. 4 bedrooms, 3 full baths, hardwood floors throughout, completely paid off. What he didn't know was that this house was just the beginning. I pulled out my laptop and opened the file I'd been updating for 3 years. The spreadsheet Kevin had created to track my holdings was color-coded: green for fully owned properties, yellow for partnerships, blue for agricultural investments. The screen filled with more green than most people would see in a lifetime. The apartment building downtown, 4 units, purchased 8 years ago when the neighborhood was still considered questionable. Now, with the urban renewal project, each unit rented for 3 times what I'd originally charged. Charlie had been in graduate school then, too busy with his MBA to notice that his mother's part-time bookkeeping job was actually property management. The commercial strip on 5th Avenue, 3 storefronts I'd bought during the recession when businesses were failing and property could be had for pennies on the dollar. Now they housed a trendy coffee shop, a boutique that catered to young professionals, and a law office. The rent from just one of those units covered my yearly expenses. The agricultural land, 140 acres of prime farmland 2 counties over, where Charlie thought I went to visit my elderly mother. Mother had been dead for 6 years, but the land she'd left me had been the foundation for everything else. I'd used her small inheritance as seed money, literally and figuratively. Now I leased that land to organic farmers, and the income from it alone would have supported a comfortable retirement. But I wasn't retiring. I was just getting started. The doorbell rang at 11:30. I opened it to find Sophie Gauthier, my real estate agent, holding a folder thick with documents. Marcia, the Price farm just came on the market. The family wants to sell before the end of the year for tax purposes. 43 acres adjacent to your current holdings, plus the original farmhouse. Sophie's eyes were bright with excitement. She was young, maybe 30, but she understood money in a way that reminded me of myself 20 years ago. The asking price is steep, but with your current portfolio, financing won't be a problem. I invited Sophie in for coffee, spreading the photographs and property surveys across my dining room table. The farmhouse needed work, but it was solid. The land was perfect for expanding the organic farming operation. Most importantly, it would bring my total agricultural holdings to just over 200 acres. Make an offer, I said. 10% below asking, contingent on inspection, closing within 60 days. Sophie nodded, making notes in her tablet. Marcia, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Why haven't you ever mentioned your son? I mean, we've been working together for 3 years, and you've never once brought him into these discussions. Most parents would want their children involved in financial decisions this significant. I looked at the photographs of the Price farm, imagining the additional income it would generate, the legacy it would become part of. Sophie, my son believes I've never accomplished anything in my life. I've decided to let him continue believing that. Sophie stared at me for a long moment. For how long? Until he learns otherwise. After Sophie left, I returned to my laptop and opened the other file I maintained. This one was labeled Charlie, Education and Expenses. 23 years of financial records, from pediatric checkups to MBA tuition. The total was staggering, even to me, but it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the pattern. Every car payment, every insurance premium, every textbook, every spring break trip, every security deposit for every apartment he'd ever lived in. I had records of it all, because I'd paid for it all. Not just the big expenses, but the small ones too, the ones that add up over time into something substantial. The engagement ring Charlie had given Christina. I'd co-signed the loan because his credit wasn't established enough for the financing he'd needed. The honeymoon they were currently enjoying, paid for with a credit card I'd given him for emergencies during his last year of graduate school. The down payment on the condo they'd bought together, funded by the gift I'd given them for Christmas. Money I'd told them came from selling some of my mother's jewelry. Charlie thought Christina was successful because she drove a BMW and owned her own condo. What he didn't know was that success built on someone else's foundation isn't really success at all. It's an illusion, and illusions are fragile things. My phone buzzed with a text message. Kevin Cook. Documents delivered. Are you prepared for the response? I typed back quickly. More prepared than he is. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, quiet and full of anticipation. I made myself a late lunch and ate it slowly, savoring each bite. Tonight, Charlie would learn that his mother hadn't spent the last 3 years visiting a gravesite. She'd been building an empire. Tomorrow, he would discover that the woman he'd publicly dismissed as irrelevant controlled more wealth than he'd ever imagined. And next week, he'd realize that none of it would ever be his. I thought about calling Heather back, explaining what was about to happen. But some things needed to unfold in their own time, and some lessons needed to be learned without warning. The phone rang at 6:43 p.m. I was in my garden, deadheading the late roses that would bloom once more before winter set in. My hands were dirty with soil, my nails caked with earth, the kind of honest work my son had never seen me do, though I'd been tending this garden for 15 years. When I saw his name on the caller ID, I let it ring twice more before answering, wiping my hands clean on my gardening apron. Hello, Charlie. What the hell is this? His voice was sharp, strained, nothing like the confident tone he'd used during his wedding speech 3 days ago. In the background, I could hear Christina asking questions, her voice high with confusion. You'll need to be more specific. I settled into the wrought iron chair I'd placed under the oak tree, the one that gave me the best view of the garden I'd cultivated, the house I'd maintained, the life I'd built while he was busy becoming successful. These documents, Mom, These legal documents that just arrived. They're saying you're removing me from your will, that there's some trust fund I never knew about, that you own—" He stopped abruptly, and I could hear papers rustling. "It says here you own 4 apartment buildings, commercial properties, nearly 200 acres of farmland. That can't be right. Why can't it be right?" The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. In the background, Christina was still talking, but her voice had dropped to a whisper. Because you don't—" Charlie struggled with the words. "You never had money. We never had money. Remember? Remember how you used to worry about the electric bill, how you'd clip coupons, how you worked those awful jobs. I remember working 3 jobs to keep us in this house and you in college," I said quietly. "I remember choosing not to date because every spare moment and every spare dollar went to your future. I remember a lot of things, Charlie. But this paperwork says you've been buying property for 8 years. 8 years, Mom. That's impossible. You were just getting by. You were nobody special. You were nobody special." Those words hit differently than his wedding speech had. The speech had been public humiliation, performed cruelty. But this was private truth, what my son actually thought of me when no one was watching. I was never nobody, Charlie. I was invisible. There's a difference. This doesn't make sense. His voice was rising now, the control he'd inherited from his father finally cracking. "Where did this money come from? Where did you get the capital to buy buildings? You're a retired nurse who worked part-time bookkeeping jobs." I stood and walked to the edge of my property, where the fence line marked the boundary of the quarter-acre lot I'd fought to keep when the mortgage payment seemed impossible. From here, I could see 3 of the houses where I'd done part-time bookkeeping, accounting work that had evolved into financial consulting, then investment partnerships, then property acquisitions. "Charlie, do you remember Dr. Josh?" "What? The doctor from the hospital? What does he have to do with anything?" "He wanted to invest in rental properties but didn't have time to manage them. I had time but not capital. So we formed a partnership. I found the properties, managed the renovations, handled the tenants. He provided the initial investment. After 3 years, the properties were profitable enough that I could buy out his share." More silence. Then Christina's voice, clearer now. "Charlie, ask her about the business cards." "What business cards?" I asked. Christina must have taken the phone because suddenly her voice was right there, close and questioning. "Marcia, there are business cards in this envelope. Cards that say Marcia Schmidt, Property Management and Investment Consulting. The address is your house." I smiled, though they couldn't see it. Christina had always been more observant than my son. "I've been running that business for 6 years, Christina." The bookkeeping jobs Charlie dismissed were actually consulting contracts with small business owners who needed help structuring their finances for property investment. "But why?" Charlie's voice was back, confused and angry. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were struggling? When did you ask?" The question came out sharper than I'd intended, but it was the right question. "When, in the last 5 years, did you ask me about my life, my work, my goals? When did you show any interest in who I was beyond your mother?" The line went quiet except for the sound of their breathing. "You called me twice last year, Charlie. Twice. Once to tell me you were engaged, once to ask if I could contribute to the wedding expenses. Both conversations lasted less than 10 minutes, and in both, you did most of the talking. Mom, that's not— Last Christmas, when you were here for exactly 4 hours. You spent 3 of them on your phone with work calls. When I tried to tell you about the commercial property I was considering purchasing, you said, 'That's nice, Mom,' and went back to your email." I could hear Christina murmuring something to Charlie, but I couldn't make out the words. "The wedding speech," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion gathering in my chest, "was just the public version of what you've been telling yourself about me for years. That I'm nobody special, that I never accomplished anything, that I just existed while you went out and achieved. I didn't mean—" "You meant every word." I sat back down in my chair, looking at the roses I'd planted, the garden I'd designed, the home I'd created and maintained through sheer force of will. "And you know what, Charlie? You were right about one thing. I never did achieve anything you would recognize as success." The silence on the other end was complete now, because your definition of success is performance, recognition, public validation. My definition of success is security, independence, building something that lasts. I paused, letting that sink in. By your measure, I'm nobody. By my measure, you're a child playing dress-up with money I helped you earn. That's not fair. Fair. The word came out like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Charlie, do you know what I paid for your MBA? We took out loans. I co-signed loans that you defaulted on during your first year of marriage. I've been making those payments for 18 months. The we in your statement is actually me. I could hear papers rustling again, Christina and Charlie talking in urgent whispers. Do you know what I contributed to your wedding? You said you couldn't afford. I said I couldn't afford what you were asking for directly, but I paid for the flowers, the photography, the rehearsal dinner, and half the reception hall. I did it through vendors I have business relationships with, and I asked them to bill it as discounts or wedding gifts so you wouldn't know it came from me. The silence was deafening now. Why? Christina's voice was small, confused. Why would you do all that and not tell us? Because I wanted my son to believe he was successful on his own merits. I wanted him to have the confidence that comes from thinking you've earned what you have. I stood again, pacing to the gate that led to my backyard. I thought if I supported him quietly, he'd grow into someone who might eventually see me as more than just a placeholder in his life. Mom, but your wedding speech taught me something, Charlie. It taught me that invisible support isn't appreciated. It's ignored. It taught me that sacrificing myself for your success didn't make you grateful. It made you dismissive. It taught me that I raised a man who sees kindness as weakness and humility as failure. I could hear Christina crying softly in the background. So, I've made a decision, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. I'm done being invisible. I'm done supporting someone who sees me as nobody special. I'm done pretending that my accomplishments don't matter because they're not the kind of accomplishments that get applause at wedding receptions. What does that mean? Charlie's voice was barely audible. It means, son, that the woman who never did anything with her life is taking back control of the life she actually built. I looked at the legal documents Sophie had left on my patio table, the papers for the Price Farm purchase that would expand my holdings beyond anything Charlie had imagined. It means you're about to discover what success actually looks like when it's built on something more solid than other people's sacrifices. Are you disowning me? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from a dying fire. For a moment, I considered softening the blow, offering the comfort that had always been my default response to his distress. But comfort hadn't taught him respect. Support hadn't earned me consideration. Love hadn't prevented public humiliation. No, Charlie, I'm not disowning you. I paused, watching a cardinal land on the fence post, bright red against the darkening sky. I'm simply stopping the practice of owning nothing myself so that you could own everything. I ended the call before he could respond, before Christina could plead, before the conversation could devolve into the kind of emotional manipulation that had governed our relationship for too long. The evening was quiet after that, peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I finished deadheading the roses as darkness fell, then went inside to pour myself a glass of wine, not the cheap bottle I used to buy, but a bottle of Cabernet I'd been saving for a special occasion. Tonight felt special enough. The silence lasted 3 weeks. 3 weeks of no phone calls, no texts, no surprise visits that had once punctuated my predictable routine. 3 weeks of Charlie processing what he'd learned, of Christina probably trying to convince him to call, of their new marriage navigating its first real crisis. 3 weeks of me discovering what my life looked like when it truly belonged to me. I closed on the Price Farm on a Tuesday morning in October. Sophie Gauthier met me at the property with champagne, and the kind of smile that comes from closing a deal everyone said was impossible. The farmhouse needed work, but it was solid. 1890s construction with good bones and a wraparound porch that overlooked rolling hills that were now mine. Marcia, you realize what this makes you? Sophie asked as we walked through the empty rooms, our footsteps echoing on original hardwood floors that just needed refinishing. What does it make me? One of the largest private landowners in 3 counties. Between this property and your existing holdings, you control almost 250 acres of prime agricultural and development land. She stopped at a window that looked out over the fields where corn had grown for 6 generations. You're not just wealthy, Marcia. You're powerful. Powerful. The word felt strange in my mouth when I repeated it later that evening, sitting on the farmhouse porch with a cup of coffee and watching the sunset paint the sky the color of late roses. I'd never thought of myself as powerful. I'd thought of myself as careful, strategic, determined. But Sophie was right. Land was power, and I had more of it than most people would accumulate in several lifetimes. The irony wasn't lost on me that Charlie had spent his honeymoon in Jamaica while I was closing deals that would reshape the economic landscape of an entire region. My phone rang as I was locking up the farmhouse, preparing to drive back to the city. Heather Price's name appeared on the screen. Not my old neighbor Heather, but the matriarch of the family that had just sold me their ancestral land. Ms. Schmidt, this is Heather Price. I hope you don't mind me calling. Of course not, Mrs. Price. Is everything all right with the sale? Oh, the sale is fine. Perfect, actually. But I wanted to ask you something. Her voice carried the kind of authority that comes from 8 decades of making decisions and living with their consequences. What are your plans for the land? I'd been expecting this question. When you buy a family's heritage, they want to know it's going to someone who understands its value. I'm planning to expand the organic farming operation I've been developing on the adjacent property. Sustainable agriculture, working with local farmers who understand the land. I paused, watching a hawk circle overhead. I believe in preserving what works while building something better. Good. Mrs. Price's approval was audible. That's what I hoped you'd say. But I have a proposition for you, if you're interested. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in Heather Price's living room, surrounded by photographs that chronicled 90 years of family history on the land I'd just purchased. She was 88 years old, sharp as winter air, and she was offering me something I hadn't expected. My granddaughter Laura, she said, pointing to a photograph of a young woman with mud-stained jeans and calloused hands, has a degree in sustainable agriculture from UC Davis. She's been working on organic farms in California for the past 5 years, but she wants to come home. She wants to work the family land. She wants to lease it back. She wants to partner with you. Heather leaned forward, her eyes bright with the kind of intensity that probably made her a formidable negotiator in her younger years. Laura has the knowledge and the passion. You have the land and the capital. Together you could build something remarkable. I studied the photograph. Laura Price looked like she was in her late 20s, maybe early 30s, young enough to have energy and idealism, old enough to have experience and wisdom, the kind of person I might have been if I'd had different opportunities, different choices. Why me, Mrs. Price? You don't know me. I know enough. She gestured to the stack of documents on her coffee table. The purchase agreement, the property surveys, the financing papers. I know you paid cash for one of the most expensive properties in the county. I know you've been quietly building a portfolio of agricultural land for years. And I know you understand the difference between owning something and stewarding it. Heather Price was right. I did understand that difference. It was the same difference between Charlie's version of success and mine, between taking and building, between consuming and creating. I'd like to meet Laura, I said. That evening, I drove back to my house in the city with Heather Price's words echoing in my mind. Partnership, stewardship, building something remarkable. After 30 years of building alone, the idea of working with someone who shared my vision felt like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. My mailbox contained the usual bills and advertisements, but there was also a thick envelope with Charlie's return address. My hands were steady as I opened it, though my pulse quickened slightly. Inside was a check for $23,000 and a letter written in my son's careful handwriting. Mom, Christina, and I have been going through our finances, trying to figure out how much we owe you. This check covers what we can calculate. The loan payments you've been making, part of the wedding expenses. The gifts we now realize weren't gifts at all. I know it's not enough. I know it doesn't even come close to what you've done for us over the years. But it's what we can afford right now. And I wanted you to know that we're trying to make this right. I've been thinking about what you said during our phone call, about how I never asked about your life, your work, your goals. You're right. I was so focused on building my own success that I never wondered what you were building. I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to undo years of taking you for granted. but I want to try, if you'll let me. Can we talk? Can we start over? Charlie. I read the letter twice, then set it aside and looked at the check. $23,000. A fraction of what I'd actually spent on Charlie's success over the years. But the amount itself wasn't the point. The gesture was the point. The recognition was the point. But recognition after humiliation felt different than recognition freely given. Apologies after exposure felt different than apologies from genuine understanding. I thought about Laura Price, young and passionate and ready to build something meaningful on land that had been tended for generations. I thought about Sophie Gauthier, who saw me as a successful businesswoman rather than someone's invisible mother. I thought about Heather, my old neighbor, who remembered my sacrifices. I thought about the people who had always seen me clearly, and the people who were just beginning to see me at all. Then I thought about Charlie, writing this letter not because he'd had a revelation about my worth, but because legal documents had forced him to confront truths he'd been determined to ignore. I folded the letter carefully and put it in my desk drawer, next to the file labeled Charlie, Education and Expenses. Tomorrow, I would deposit the check. Not because I needed the money, but because accepting it was part of Charlie learning what his choices had cost. The phone rang at 9 o'clock. Laura Price's number, which her grandmother had given me. Ms. Schmidt? This is Laura. Grandma Heather said you might be interested in talking about a partnership. Her voice was warm, confident, eager. The voice of someone who had a vision and the skills to make it reality. The voice of someone who saw opportunity rather than obligation. I am interested, Laura. Very interested. When can we meet? Tomorrow? I could drive over from Sacramento. I'd love to see the land. Talk about possibilities. Tomorrow works perfectly. After I hung up, I poured myself another glass of the good wine and sat in my living room, looking at the space I'd created and maintained through years of careful planning and quiet determination. Tomorrow, I would meet someone who might become the first person to truly understand what I'd been building all these years. Someone who saw land not as an asset to own, but as a legacy to nurture. Charlie's letter sat in my desk drawer, unanswered but not ignored. His attempt at reconciliation was noted, filed away with all the other data points I'd been collecting about my son's character for 28 years. But tonight wasn't about Charlie. Tonight was about Laura Price, and the partnership that might transform my agricultural holdings from a business investment into something living and growing and meaningful. Tonight was about discovering that the empire I'd built in silence was large enough to share with someone who deserved it. Laura Price arrived at dawn with dirt under her fingernails and a vision that made my breath catch. We met at the farmhouse as the sun was rising over the fields that had once belonged to her family and now belonged to me. She was 31 years old, with her grandmother's sharp eyes and the kind of weathered hands that come from years of honest work. When she looked at the land, she didn't see acreage or investment potential. She saw possibility. 250 acres of prime soil, she said, kneeling to run dirt through her fingers like she was reading scripture. Grandmother said you're interested in organic farming, but I think we could do something bigger, something revolutionary. I watched her map out her vision with gestures that encompassed the rolling hills, the creek that ran through the eastern boundary, the barn that would need to be rebuilt, community-supported agriculture, educational programs for urban children who had never seen food grow, a farm-to-table restaurant that would showcase what sustainable agriculture could produce, workshops for beginning farmers, a demonstration site for universities studying regenerative practices. It would take 5 years to build, Laura continued, her enthusiasm infectious despite the early hour, maybe longer. But by the time we're finished, this place could be feeding hundreds of families while healing the land instead of depleting it. What would you need from me? Partnership. Real partnership. I contribute the knowledge and the labor. You contribute the land and the capital. We split everything 50-50. Profits, decisions, ownership of any improvements. I studied her face, looking for the calculation I'd learned to expect from people who wanted something from me. There was none. Laura Price was offering to work herself into exhaustion to build something that would outlast us both, and she wanted to do it as equals. I've never had a real partner before, I admitted. Why not? Because I learned early that partnership requires trust, and trust requires being seen. I spent so many years being invisible that I forgot how to be anything else. Laura smiled, and it transformed her entire face. Well, you're pretty visible now. When I drove up this morning, I could see you standing on the porch from half a mile away. Hard to miss someone who owns the horizon. Someone who owns the horizon. I liked that better than any title I'd ever held. We spent the morning walking every acre of the property, Laura pointing out drainage patterns and soil composition, while I calculated the financial investment her vision would require. By noon, we had the framework of an agreement that would have impressed Kevin Cook with its thoroughness. My phone rang as we were sharing lunch on the farmhouse porch. Charlie's name appeared on the screen for the first time since his letter arrived 4 days ago. "Take it," Laura suggested, noticing my hesitation. "I'll give you privacy." But I shook my head. "Actually, would you mind staying? I think I'd like a witness for this conversation." Charlie's voice was careful, controlled. Nothing like the panic I'd heard 3 weeks ago. "Mom, did you get my letter?" "I did." "And the check?" "I deposited it. Thank you." Silence stretched between us while Laura pretended to study the property survey we'd been reviewing. "I was hoping we could talk," Charlie continued. "In person. Christina and I would like to come see you. Maybe this weekend?" "I'm not available this weekend. I'm meeting with contractors about renovating a farmhouse." "A farmhouse?" The confusion in his voice was genuine. "Are you buying another property?" "I bought it 2 weeks ago. 250 acres of agricultural land. I'm converting it into a sustainable farming operation." More silence, longer this time. "Mom, I don't understand. When did you become this? When did you become someone who buys farms and runs businesses and makes decisions about hundreds of acres of land?" I looked at Laura, who was listening with undisguised interest, and felt something shift inside my chest. The question Charlie was asking wasn't really about when I'd become successful. It was about when I'd become someone he didn't recognize, someone who existed independently of his needs and expectations. "I became this person gradually, Charlie, over many years, while you weren't paying attention. But why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think? Think what? That I was nobody special?" The words came out sharper than I'd intended, but they needed to be said. "Charlie, I tried to tell you. For years, I tried to share what I was building. You weren't interested in listening." Laura's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent. "I want to listen now," Charlie said, his voice small. "I want to understand. Why now?" "Because—" he struggled with the words. "Because I realized that everything I thought I'd accomplished on my own was actually built on your foundation. The confidence I had, the opportunities I took, the risks I could afford to take, all of it was possible because you were there, supporting me, and I never even saw it." It was a good answer, maybe even a true answer, but it was also an answer that had come only after legal documents forced him to confront realities he'd preferred to ignore. "Charlie, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "Okay. If those legal documents had never been delivered, if you'd never learned about my business holdings, would you have called me?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Would you have wondered why your mother seemed content with a life you considered so limited? Would you have asked about my goals, my dreams, my accomplishments? Would you have seen me as anything more than the woman who raised you and then stepped aside so you could become successful?" "Mom?" "Would you, Charlie?" Another long pause. Then quietly, "Probably not." The honesty was brutal and necessary. Laura was watching me now, her expression thoughtful, waiting to see how I would respond to this admission. "Thank you for that honesty," I said. "It helps me understand something important." "What's that?" "It helps me understand that your desire to repair our relationship is motivated by guilt and obligation, not by genuine interest in who I am as a person." I stood up, walking to the edge of the porch where I could see the fields that would soon be transformed into something meaningful. "And that's not enough foundation for the kind of relationship I want to have. What kind of relationship do you want?" I looked at Laura, who had spent 4 hours listening to my ideas, challenging my assumptions, building on my vision. I thought about Sophie Gauthier, who treated me as an equal in every business discussion. I thought about Heather Price, who had seen my potential and trusted me with her family's legacy. I want relationships with people who see me clearly from the beginning, Charlie. People who value my contributions because they understand my worth, not because legal documents forced them to acknowledge it. But I'm your son. Yes, you are. And that means we have a connection that can't be severed. But it doesn't mean you have an unlimited claim on my time, my resources, or my forgiveness. Laura stood up, gathering the property surveys with movements that suggested she was preparing to leave me privacy for the rest of this conversation. But I gestured for her to stay. Charlie, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. You're going to take time to really think about who I am now, not who you remember me being. You're going to consider whether you actually want a relationship with this version of your mother, the version who makes independent decisions and has priorities that don't revolve around your needs. Of course I want. Don't answer quickly. Think about it, because if you decide you do want that relationship, it will be on completely different terms. I won't be the invisible support system I was for 30 years. I won't prioritize your comfort over my own truth. And I won't pretend that your wedding speech didn't reveal exactly how you see me. The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. How long do I have to think? Charlie asked finally. As long as you need. But understand that while you're thinking, I'm living. I'm building partnerships with people who value what I bring to the table. I'm creating something meaningful with my resources and my expertise. I'm not waiting for you to decide I'm worthy of your attention. After I ended the call, Laura and I sat in comfortable silence, watching the afternoon light shift across the fields that would soon be transformed. That was beautifully handled, she said finally. Was it? You gave him truth without cruelty, consequences without hatred. That takes remarkable strength. I thought about that as we finalized our partnership agreement that evening, sitting at my dining room table with papers spread between us like a blueprint for the future. Laura would move back to Iowa within the month. We would begin construction on the new barn in spring. By this time next year, we would have the first crops in the ground and the first educational programs scheduled. For the first time in my adult life, I was building something that would carry my name, reflect my values, and exist because I had envisioned it. Not for my son's benefit, not in service of someone else's dream, but because I had something to offer the world. Charlie's letter was still in my desk drawer, along with the file documenting 28 years of his expenses. Someday, maybe, we would have the relationship I'd described to him, one built on mutual respect and genuine interest. Or maybe we wouldn't. Either way, I would be fine, because the empire I'd built in silence had found its voice, and its voice was saying something beautiful. It was saying that Marcia Schmidt was nobody's invisible mother anymore. She was someone who